When a star quarterback of an American football team refused to stand for the national anthem at a game in August this year, the news went global. American football player Colin Kaepernick refuses to stand for the anthem, reads the BBC News headline. It quotes him, "I'm not going to stand up to show pride in a flag for a country that oppresses black people and people of colour." The report goes on, Kaepernick has been outspoken on social media about race relations and is a supporter of the Black Lives Matter movement. The Washington Post reported that Kaepernick's refusal created an immediate discussion in every NFL locker room about whether other players would speak out on the social issue of police brutality against people of colour. Not only that, his actions, the newspaper declared, shook up the country. In fact, of course, what shook up the country began several years before. Black Lives Matter began online after the slogan was coined in response to the Trayvon Martin case by Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors and Opal Tometi, as detailed by Garza in A History of the Black Lives Matter movement in the Feminist Wire. Trayvon Martin, an unarmed 17-year-old, was fatally shot in the chest by local neighbourhood watch volunteer George Zimmerman in Florida in 2012, as Trayvon returned from buying himself a packet of Skittles and an iced tea, as reported by the New York Times. Zimmerman was arrested 6 weeks later, but only after civil rights leaders championed the case and demonstrators, many wearing hoodies, marched in Sanford, Miami and elsewhere to demand action. At his trial a year later, Zimmerman was found not guilty of murder and acquitted of manslaughter after claiming he acted in self-defense based on the controversial Stand Your Ground laws. The verdict was so blatant in its disregard for black life that it set in motion what would become the most sustained and militant social movement America has seen in a generation. But, as the New York Times chronicled in How Black Lives Matter Came to Define a Movement, it wasn't until the summer of 2014 that Black Lives Matter began to flicker to life as a Twitter hashtag and street demonstrations erupted after the deaths of Michael Brown in Ferguson on the 9th of August and Eric Garner in New York City on the 17th of July. Garner's last words, as he was choked to death by an NYPD officer, were, "I can't breathe." This became one of the most used chants of the movement. As the piece describes, 3 key events followed. In November, 12-year-old Tamir Rice was shot dead by a police officer in Cleveland. 2 days later, prosecutors announced that Darren Wilson, the officer who killed Michael Brown, would not be indicted, and on December 3rd, a grand jury declined to indict the officers who killed Eric Garner. The death of 25-year-old Freddie Gray on April 19, 2015, from injuries sustained in the back of a police van in Baltimore, accelerated the protests, as The Guardian reported. Another Guardian article stated, intense rioting broke out following the funeral service for Freddie Gray, in which 15 police officers were injured. As The Atlantic reported in Protesters and Police Clash in Baltimore, Maryland Governor Larry Hogan declared a state of emergency and called out the National Guard, and Baltimore Mayor Stephanie Rawlings Blake announced that a week-long curfew would be imposed on the city. By May, according to the BBC article Freddie Gray protests in several US cities, there had been new protests across the US, including in New York and Washington, D.C. Countless responses to the Black Lives Matter protests, in particular in Ferguson and Baltimore, painted the demonstrators as irresponsible, violent, thuggish, including the president himself, who called them criminals and thugs destroying their own communities, as quoted by the New York Post. The Guardian pointed out, media coverage of Michael Brown's shooting exposes underlying prejudice. An independent report found a racial bias in the mainstream coverage of Ferguson that was at odds with what was happening on the ground, as Vice reported in The Media Needs to be Taught How to Report on Race, says Ferguson report. There was one particularly grotesque axis of criticism. The Chicago Tribune's piece, Chicago Cop is the Face of the Ferguson Effect, outlined the idea that increased scrutiny of law enforcement after the 2014 police killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson has led to cops declining to engage. Which might be more convincing were it not for the numbers dead. The US, astoundingly, keeps no record of how many of its own citizens its own police force kills. The Guardian therefore launched its own project, The Counted, and last year recorded 1,146 dead. This year, there have been 883 by the 30th of October. One common response to Black Lives Matter has been the counter-slogan, All Lives Matter, as reported in the San Diego Union-Tribune, All Lives Matter march held in Oceanside, and the Providence Journal, Small Protest in Providence declares All Lives Matter. as if protesting black deaths at the hands of the state has, all along, really been about putting white people down. Such ill-considered bad faith prompted a flurry of responses, such as the New York Times' "Why All Lives Matter is such a perilous phrase," and the Washington Post's "Why saying all lives matter is misguided." It states that the point of the chant is not the racist idea that white lives don't matter, but instead the constitutionally based idea that black lives do matter just as much as white ones. There was worse. After the recent murders of 2 NYPD officers, a new call emerged: Blue Lives Matter, as the BBC reported. Police lives matter too, an article in the Chicago Tribune claimed, highlighting the isolation felt by officers as they dangle between the whims of the politicians desperate for votes and the anger of some neighbourhoods. Where to begin in response? For a start, there's a major difference between occupation and race. But leaving that aside, the US police killed on average 3 people per day in 2015, and of course such violence is not ethnically indiscriminate. As the Washington Post reported in its piece, "Aren't more white people than black people killed by police? Yes, but no. Black Americans are 2.5 times as likely as white Americans to be shot and killed by police officers." And as the Wall Street Journal points out in "Police Rarely Criminally Charged for On-Duty Shootings," despite killing in the region of 1,000 people per year, just 41 officers were charged with murder or manslaughter over 7 years. And of course, in 2016, no reactionary backlash would be complete without some burped-up toxins from Donald Trump. As The Guardian reports, Trump on Colin Kaepernick, he should find a country that works better for him. The reaction of Black Lives Matter to the current presidential election season revealed a variety of opinion within the movement, inevitable for any such horizontal organisation. The New York Times piece, "One Slogan, Many Methods, Black Lives Matter Enters Politics," describes the movement as struggling to find its voice as the activists who fly its banner wade into national politics. Some activists protested Bernie Sanders events, even shutting down one event as reported by the Seattle Times. Others targeted Hillary Clinton, reported by the Huffington Post in its piece, "Black Lives Matter Activists Interrupt Hillary Clinton at Private Event in South Carolina." In the first case, the protesters demanded Bernie give more consideration to black voters, police brutality, and issues of race. In the latter, they reminded the world that during her husband's presidency, Hillary described young black men as super predators, and of her support for and role in policies resulting in the hugely disproportionate incarceration of black Americans. But such interventions, and this presidential race, have revealed crucial differences between some of the self-styled leadership of the Black Lives Matter movement and the activist base. Among the former, most famously, DeRay McKennison made a bid for mayor of Baltimore, and recently published an op-ed in the Washington Post in full support of Hillary Clinton for president, stating that Clinton's platform on racial justice is strong, it is informed by the policy failings of the past, and is a vision for where we need to go. This is a real break from the political direction of many grassroots Black Lives Matter activists, who have begun to use their platform to raise other issues alongside police violence, including prison abolitionist politics, anti-imperialism, Palestine solidarity, social housing, and more. They recently launched the Movement for Black Lives, a broad coalition including various groups, ranging from the Black Lives Matter Network to Jews for Palestinian Right of Return, behind a 6-point programme: ending the war on black people through police brutality and incarceration, reparations not only for slavery but for surveillance, incarceration, housing redlining and colonialism, investment in education and health and divestment from incarceration, economic justice, community control and political power. This platform, of course, has been almost entirely ignored by the media. Black Lives Matter's level of sustained protests, direct action and civil disobedience, their support from celebrities from Beyoncé to Kaepernick, and their coalition building and political development have inspired activists internationally too. Groups have used the Black Lives Matter label in Canada, Germany, Amsterdam, the UK and France. The Globe and Mail reported in their piece, Black Lives Matter Protest Death of Abdirahman Abdi Across Canada, that Black Lives Matter staged 7 rallies across Canada on Wednesday to protest the recent police-involved death of a Somali-Canadian man in Ottawa, its first nationwide action that signals rising momentum in what some activists consider a new civil rights movement. In France, the BBC reported clashes near Paris after young black man dies in police custody. The report states that they come ahead of a planned march against police brutality in Paris on Saturday using the slogan Black Lives Matter. Al Jazeera's piece, "In France, Black Lives Matter has become a rallying cry," reports that the hashtags BLM France and Justice pour Adama went viral on Twitter within the country. The Washington Post, in How the Black Lives Matter movement is sweeping the globe, reports 500 protesters in Berlin and 400 in Amsterdam, while the New York Times piece, Black Lives Matter activists stage protests across Britain, reported the nationwide shutdown called on the 5th anniversary of the death of Mark Duggan, the 29-year-old black man shot by police in 2011, whose death sparked riots in several cities. Of course, all of these countries have their own ugly and specific histories in relation to colonialism and therefore to race relations, but it is clear that there are enough shared dynamics of racism, not least in the state's terrifying power over life and death, for Black Lives Matter to have crossed oceans.